Helmand Province, Afghanistan. 3:47 a.m. A compound door opens in a village that appears on no map. A man steps into darkness, surrounded by bodyguards. 3,000 miles away, an MI6 officer speaks 2 words into a secure line. Positive identification. Seconds later, the night erupts. The man called the Wolf of Kabul lies dead in the rubble. The wolf had killed more British soldiers than any single Taliban commander. His IED networks turned Helmand's roads into killing fields. His intelligence operation penetrated Afghan forces so deeply that British patrols walked into ambushes he had planned days in advance. For 3 years, he moved like a ghost through tribal networks. Western forces could not see. Killing him required something drones could not provide. It required penetrating the human networks that protected him, turning his own people into instruments of his destruction. 3 years of patient intelligence work in the most hostile environment on Earth. This is the story of how MI6 hunted the Wolf of Kabul and turned a man who believed himself untouchable into coordinates on a screen. The strike itself lasted less than 4 minutes. British Special Forces had positioned themselves in the darkness hours before, guided by coordinates transmitted from an operations centre in London. They knew the compound layout from months of reconnaissance. They knew which doors would be used, which walls could be breached, which escape routes the bodyguards would attempt. When the order came, they moved with the precision of men who had rehearsed every step. The wolf died surrounded by his inner circle. The men who had protected him for years fell beside him. By dawn, the assault team had extracted with hard drives, documents, and phones that would expose his entire network. The compound stood empty, a message written in silence. But the strike itself was not the achievement. The achievement was knowing where to strike. The wolf had evaded Western forces for years, despite the largest military deployment since World War II. Drones watched Afghanistan around the clock. Signals intelligence intercepted every electronic communication. Special forces conducted hundreds of raids across Helmand. None of it touched him. He used no phone. He travelled on foot through villages where every face looked the same to Western eyes. He understood surveillance better than the officers hunting him and moved through its blind spots with practiced ease. Informants who tried to report on him disappeared. Their bodies appeared in markets as warnings. The population that might have helped was too terrified to speak. The wolf had built a counterintelligence operation that hunted the hunters. How do you kill a man who knows exactly how you hunt? The answer was not technology or firepower. It was patience. The strike that killed the wolf was the culmination of 3 years of human intelligence work. MI6 had built networks inside Taliban territory. They had mapped the invisible architecture of the insurgency. They had turned his own protection into the instrument of his death. Understanding the hunt requires understanding the prey. The man they called the Wolf was born in Kandahar Province in the early 1970s to a family with deep roots in the Pashtun tribal networks that had governed southern Afghanistan for centuries. His father fought against the Soviets. His uncles ran smuggling routes through Pakistan. By the time he was 15, he was carrying messages between Mujahideen commanders in the mountains, learning the geography of insurgency before he learned to read. He rose through Taliban ranks during the 1990s, but not as a fighter. He understood early what many commanders never grasped. Information was more valuable than bullets. While others led assaults, he built networks. He recruited sources. He learned who could be trusted and who could be turned. By 2006, he commanded Taliban intelligence operations across southern Afghanistan. His networks reached inside Afghan police units, inside army battalions, inside the government offices, where Western forces coordinated their campaigns. He knew which officers could be bribed, which could be blackmailed, and which had to be killed. He identified collaborators with surgical precision and ordered their executions as public warnings. Their bodies appeared in markets, messages written in flesh. British and American forces called him the Wolf because he hunted those who hunted him. His signature contribution was the industrialization of IED warfare. He established supply chains that moved bomb components from Pakistan through tribal networks into Helmand. He recruited bomb makers and trained them in techniques specifically designed to defeat British countermeasures: pressure plates, radio triggers, devices hidden in culverts and buried beneath roads that British convoys travelled daily. Between 2008 and 2010, his networks were responsible for dozens of British casualties. Young men who left bases in armoured vehicles and returned in body bags. But his most devastating capability was penetration. The Wolf had sources inside Afghan units that patrolled alongside British forces. Patrol routes reached him before missions launched. Base layouts arrived with annotations showing weak points. Operational schedules gave him days to prepare ambushes. British soldiers walked into kill zones he had orchestrated while sitting in compounds 50 miles away. By 2008, MI6 had designated him a priority target. His file in London contained surveillance photos, intercepted communications, and forensic evidence linking him to specific attacks. What it did not contain was location. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same compound twice, never using phones, never travelling by vehicle. Finding him would require penetrating the networks that protected him. Southern Afghanistan in 2008 was not a country in any meaningful sense. It was a patchwork of tribal territories where central government had never truly existed. Mountains blocked satellite coverage. Villages had no addresses, no registered inhabitants, no documents. People moved through landscapes that had not changed in centuries. Western intelligence systems designed for nation-states found nothing to grip. Power flowed through tribal and family connections invisible to outsiders. A man's loyalty was determined by blood, marriage, and debt obligations that predated living memory. These networks could move information, money, and fighters across hundreds of miles without leaving traces that technology could detect. Messages passed through chains of cousins and in-laws. Decisions were made in gatherings that left no records. The Taliban did not hide inside Afghanistan. They lived inside its social fabric, indistinguishable from the population they had emerged from. American drones could watch any point on the map. Signals intelligence could intercept every electronic communication within range of a cell tower. But the Wolf did not use phones. He did not send emails. He did not travel in vehicles that satellites could track. He moved on foot through villages surrounded by men who looked exactly like every other man in Helmand. Facial recognition could not distinguish him from a farmer. Thermal imaging could not separate him from the population, sleeping in compounds across the province. Technology was blind without human eyes to guide it. Traditional agent recruitment required approaching individuals and persuading them to betray their organizations. In Helmand, approach itself was nearly impossible. Every stranger was assumed to be either Taliban or informant. The Wolf's counterintelligence network executed suspected collaborators publicly. Their bodies displayed as warnings to anyone considering cooperation with foreign forces. The penalty for talking was death. The penalty for being suspected of talking was death. The population understood this calculation clearly. MI6 recognized that hunting the Wolf required a fundamentally different model. Not a single penetration agent, but a network of overlapping sources who did not know each other existed. Not direct recruitment, but patient cultivation through tribal intermediaries who provided layers of deniability. Not technology-led hunting, but human-led targeting that used drones and satellites only at the final moment when coordinates were already known. The operation would take years. There was no shortcut. The hunt began not with agents, but with understanding. MI6 needed to map networks that had never been mapped before. Beginning in 2008, MI6 officers launched a systematic effort to document the tribal structures of southern Afghanistan. They worked from bases in Kabul and Kandahar. But their real work happened in quieter places: safe houses in Quetta, refugee camps in Pakistan, tea rooms where elders gathered to discuss matters that never reached official channels. They interviewed merchants, refugees, and tribal figures who had fled Taliban territory. They reconstructed family trees, marriage alliances, and blood feuds going back generations. They documented which clans controlled which valleys, which families had grievances against the Taliban, which elders retained influence despite the insurgency. The goal was to understand the invisible architecture that determined who could move where and who trusted whom. The commercial networks came next. Trade routes crossed Taliban territory daily, regardless of who controlled the roads. Merchants moved goods between Pakistan and Afghanistan because commerce did not stop for war. They knew which commanders controlled which checkpoints. They knew which villages were safe and which were contested. They observed movements that no satellite could detect. MI6 identified traders with connections on both sides of the conflict. Through patient cultivation, some agreed to report on what they observed. Unusual purchases of food supplies, strangers appearing in villages, vehicles moving at night. The commercial networks became an early warning system that technology could never replicate. The refugee population provided another avenue. Thousands of Afghans had fled Taliban areas for Pakistan or urban Afghanistan. Among them were men with grievances, families whose members had been executed by Taliban justice, former fighters who had fallen from favor, men who had lost land, lost relatives, lost faith in the movement they once supported. MI6 officers worked through intermediaries to identify individuals with both access and motivation. Some agreed to return to their home districts, to reconnect with relatives still living under Taliban control, to listen and report on what they heard. They were not spies in any traditional sense. They were family members visiting home, sharing meals, attending weddings, absorbing information that flowed through tribal conversations. No single source could locate the wolf. He was too careful, too mobile, too protected by layers of security. But MI6 built overlapping networks where information from multiple sources could be cross-referenced. A trader might report unusual food purchases in a district. A returned refugee might mention relatives preparing for an important visitor. A tribal contact might describe security movements on certain roads. Individually, each piece meant nothing. Together, they began to form a picture. Every recruitment carried danger. Every meeting risked exposure. The Wolf's counterintelligence network hunted the same territory MI6 was trying to penetrate. Sources disappeared. Some were killed. Others simply stopped reporting, their silence a message in itself. Building the network cost lives, but blindness cost more. By 2010, MI6 had mapped the networks around the Wolf. Now they needed to penetrate his inner circle. The Wolf surrounded himself with 3 layers of protection. The outer layer consisted of tribal networks that controlled territory and reported any strangers who entered. The middle layer was trusted commanders who coordinated his movements, managed his logistics, and controlled access to his location. The inner layer was personal bodyguards, many of them blood relatives, who never left his side. Penetrating the inner layer was impossible. Those men would die before betraying him. But the middle layer presented opportunities. MI6 identified a Taliban sub-commander responsible for logistics in a district the Wolf frequented. The commander had a grievance. 2 years earlier, the Wolf had ordered the execution of his cousin on suspicion of collaboration with foreign forces. The suspicion was false. The cousin had been accused by a rival seeking to settle a personal dispute. The commander knew this. he had watched his cousin die for a lie. Through tribal intermediaries, MI6 made contact. Not directly. Through layers of separation that provided deniability to everyone involved. The commander believed he was working with a rival Taliban faction, seeking to undermine the Wolf's authority. He never knew British intelligence was receiving his reports. He agreed to share information about movements in his district. When important visitors arrived, he would know. When security increased on certain roads, he would notice. A second source was recruited through the commercial networks. He transported supplies for Taliban fighters, including provisions that reached the Wolf's protection detail. He knew delivery schedules, compound locations, and the routines of the men he supplied. His reporting was limited but specific. When certain quantities of food and fuel moved to certain locations, it meant commanders of significance were present. The most valuable source came through the tribal mapping project. A distant relative of the Wolf had settled in Kabul after a dispute over inheritance. The disagreement had severed his immediate ties to the family, but he maintained contact with cousins and nephews who served in the Wolf's network. Through careful cultivation over many months, he agreed to share information from family conversations. He believed he was helping negotiate a reconciliation that might restore his standing. His reporting provided context that made other intelligence interpretable. When family members mentioned travel, when they discussed preparations for meetings, when they complained about security requirements, he passed along what he heard. No single source knew the Wolf's location at any moment. The commander saw logistics. The supplier saw provisions. The relative heard family gossip. Each saw only fragments, but MI6 fused the fragments into a composite picture. When the logistics commander reported unusual activity, when the supply chain source confirmed deliveries matching patterns for high-value visitors, when family conversations mentioned gatherings, the pieces aligned. By late 2010, MI6 could predict with reasonable confidence which district the Wolf would visit and approximately when he would arrive. The net was tightening, but prediction was not enough. MI6 needed to know exactly where he would be standing. Intelligence indicated the Wolf used a network of compounds across 3 districts in northern Helmand. Each compound belonged to a tribal ally. Each provided temporary refuge where he could rest, meet subordinates, and coordinate operations before moving again. He never stayed more than 2 nights in any location. The rotation made him nearly impossible to target through conventional surveillance. MI6 tasked sources to identify these locations through observation and reported conversations. The logistics commander noted which areas received increased security. The supply source tracked where provisions flowed. The family contact mentioned locations relatives had visited. By early 2011, MI6 had mapped 7 probable safe houses. Each was photographed by satellite. Each was studied for approach routes, defensive positions, and escape options. Signals intelligence could not track the Wolf directly. He carried no phone, but pattern analysis of communications around him revealed structure. When he arrived at a location, nearby phones went silent. Commanders who normally chatted through the day stopped transmitting. When he departed, the traffic resumed. The communications gap became a signature. Silence in a district that was normally active meant something significant was present. MI6 worked with special forces to conduct discreet reconnaissance of identified compounds. Surveillance teams positioned miles away used long-range optics to study guard patterns and daily routines. Drone overflights, carefully timed to avoid detection, captured imagery of compound layouts. The intelligence built a 3-dimensional picture of each potential target location, entry points, defensive walls, likely positions for bodyguards, escape routes that would need to be blocked. A strike required near certain identification. The wrong target would be catastrophic. MI6 developed a confirmation chain requiring multiple indicators before authorization. When source reporting indicated the Wolf had arrived at a compound, signals analysis would check for communication gaps. Surveillance would attempt visual confirmation. Pattern matching would verify the security posture matched previous visits. Only when everything aligned would the strike be authorized. For months, the indicators never converged perfectly. The Wolf moved too quickly. Confirmation arrived too late. Weather prevented surveillance at critical moments. Each near miss taught lessons. The system grew more precise. MI6 officers maintained sources, refined the process, and waited for the moment when all the threads would finally converge. In March 2011, the indicators aligned. In early March 2011, the logistics commander reported unusual supply movements to a compound in northern Helmand. The quantities were larger than routine resupply. The timing matched patterns MI6 had observed before significant gatherings. Something was happening. Within 48 hours, the supply chain source confirmed deliveries matching the profile for high-value visitors. Food provisions for extended stays, fuel for generators, the kind of preparation that preceded important meetings rather than routine operations. The compound receiving the supplies was one of the 7 MI6 had identified months earlier. Signals analysis detected communication gaps spreading across the district. Phones that transmitted daily went silent. The pattern was consistent with previous observations of the Wolf's movements. When he arrived, the electronic chatter died. The family source provided the final piece. Relatives had mentioned a significant gathering for tribal negotiation. Important figures would attend. Security would be tight. The timing aligned with the other indicators. MI6 assessed with high confidence that the Wolf was traveling to the identified compound. Satellite imagery showed vehicles consistent with a command element arriving in the area. The compound layout matched reconnaissance profiles developed over months of surveillance. Everything pointed to the same location. The intelligence package was transmitted to London. Senior MI6 officers reviewed the assessment with military commanders. The convergence of sources was stronger than any previous opportunity. The strike was authorized pending positive identification at the target location. Special forces were positioned at forward operating bases within helicopter range. For 36 hours, surveillance assets watched the compound. Vehicles arrived after dark. Figures moved in shadows. The communication gap deepened across the district. Drone feeds showed security patterns consistent with a high-value presence. Additional guards on the perimeter restricted movement in surrounding areas, but positive identification required visual confirmation of the Wolf himself. The strike force waited, ready to launch within minutes of authorization. At 3:41 a.m. on March 17, 2011, a figure matching the Wolf's description exited the compound through a side door. Thermal imaging captured his movement pattern. Gait analysis matched known profiles. 2 bodyguards flanked him. 2 more held positions at the perimeter. The configuration matched intelligence on his personal protection detail. MI6 transmitted confirmation to the operations center in London. Positive identification. 3 years of patient work converged on a single set of coordinates. The strike order was given. Special Forces helicopters lifted from the forward operating base at 3:43 a.m. Flight time to target was 11 minutes. The assault team had rehearsed the compound layout dozens of times using intelligence MI6 had provided over months of surveillance. Every door was known. Every wall was mapped. Every likely defensive position had been assigned to a specific operator. The helicopters approached from the east, using terrain to mask their sound until the final moments. At 2 kilometers out, they climbed to provide fire support positions. Ground teams fast roped onto positions identified through reconnaissance. The compound was surrounded in under 90 seconds. The Wolf's guards had no time to react. Breaching charges opened the main gate. The perimeter guards were neutralized immediately. Gunfire echoed across the compound for less than a minute. The Wolf and his inner circle retreated toward a secondary exit on the northern wall. It was the escape route pattern analysis had predicted they would use. they ran directly into the secondary assault element positioned to block that path. The Wolf died in the exchange of fire. His bodyguards fell beside him. The men who had protected him for years could not protect him from an enemy that knew exactly where he would run. Biometric confirmation was completed on site within minutes. Photographs were transmitted to London. Document exploitation teams recovered phones, papers, and hard drives from the compound. The intelligence hall would expose his entire network. By dawn, the assault force had extracted. The compound stood empty. The operation had lasted under 4 minutes from breach to confirmation. Within hours, Taliban communications networks were alive with the news. The Wolf was dead. His network was compromised. Commanders who had operated under his protection understood the message. There was no hiding place that British intelligence could not penetrate. No protection network they could not turn. No shadow dark enough to guarantee safety. The documents recovered from the Wolf's compound exposed his entire intelligence network. Names of informants inside Afghan security forces, communication protocols, payment records. The architecture of penetration he had built over years was laid bare in hard drives and handwritten notes. Afghan security forces, guided by British intelligence, moved within days. Dozens of informants were arrested across southern Afghanistan. Police officers who had sold patrol routes. Army personnel who had provided base layouts. Government officials who had passed schedules and plans. The network the Wolf had constructed was dismantled in weeks. British patrols stopped walking into ambushes. IED placements became less precise. The intelligence advantage shifted. The Wolf's death created a succession crisis within Taliban intelligence operations. His replacement lacked his tribal connections. He did not have the relationships with Pakistani handlers or the institutional knowledge that made the Wolf effective. For months, Taliban operations in southern Afghanistan became reactive rather than coordinated. Attacks continued, but without the devastating precision that had characterized the Wolf's campaigns. Within intelligence circles, the operation became a case study in human intelligence targeting. It demonstrated what technology alone could not achieve against networked insurgencies. The patient building of source networks. The fusion of multiple intelligence streams. The years of preparation required to create a single, decisive moment. These lessons would shape British intelligence operations for years to come. The operation was not without cost. Sources who had provided intelligence were exposed by the documents recovered from the compound. Some had been extracted before the strike. Others could not be reached in time. The logistics commander who had reported supply movements was found dead within a month. The family contact disappeared from Kabul and was never heard from again. MI6 officers understood the trade. The sources had known the risks. The alternative was allowing the Wolf to continue killing British soldiers with intelligence he gathered from networks they could not see. The hunt for the Wolf revealed something about how modern wars are won. Technology could watch Afghanistan from space. Satellites tracked vehicle movements across entire provinces. Drones loitered over compounds for days. Signals intelligence intercepted every electronic communication within range. None of it could see into tribal networks. None of it could understand family obligations or predict where a man would sleep based on which cousin owed him hospitality. Only human intelligence could penetrate the social fabric that protected insurgent leaders. The Wolf died because MI6 understood this and invested accordingly. Modern warfare demands speed. Politicians want results measured in weeks. Commanders want targets eliminated on timelines that satisfy news cycles. The hunt for the Wolf took 3 years. There was no shortcut. The networks that located him could not be built quickly. The sources that confirmed his location could not be recruited overnight. Trust developed slowly or not at all. Tribal intermediaries required months of cultivation before they would make introductions. Patience was not a limitation of the operation. it was the strategy. The operation demonstrated that British intelligence could reach targets who believed themselves untouchable. In the most hostile environment on Earth, against an enemy who understood Western methods and had built networks specifically designed to defeat them, MI6 constructed a capability that delivered. The Wolf of Kabul is dead because British intelligence officers spent years in shadows, building relationships, cultivating sources, and waiting for the moment when all the threads would converge. That is how modern manhunts end. Not with lucky breaks or technological miracles, but with patient, invisible, relentless work. If this story of precision targeting and the invisible architecture of modern manhunting fascinated you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss when we pull back the curtain on operations that shaped history. Drop a like if this deep dive into intelligence tradecraft was worth your time. And here is your question for the comments. Does targeted killing of insurgent leaders actually end conflicts, or does it simply create vacuums that new leaders fill? Let us hear your perspective below.